Good morning. This is Ron. It is Wednesday, August the 8th. Welcome to Storytime. And thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States of America, because I'm the only one that makes the presumption for the status quo. And speaking to all you butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and today, Aristotle. Aristotle, if there is a philosophical atlas who carries the whole of Western civilization on his shoulders, it is Aristotle. He's been opposed, misinterpreted, misrepresented, and, like an axiom, used by his enemies in the very act of denying him. Whatever intellectual progress men have achieved rests on his achievements. Aristotle may be regarded as the cultural barometer of Western history. Whenever his influence dominated the scene, it paved the way for one of history's brilliant eras. Whenever it fell, so did mankind. The Aristotelian revival of the 13th century brought men to the Renaissance. The intellectual counter-revolution turned them back toward the cave of his antipode, Plato. There is only one fundamental issue in philosophy, the cognitive efficacy of man's mind. The conflict of Aristotle versus Plato is the conflict of reason versus mysticism. It was Plato who formulated most of philosophy's basic questions and doubts. It was Aristotle who laid the foundation for most of their answers. Thereafter, the record of their duel is the record of man's long struggle to deny and surrender, or to uphold and assert the validity of his particular mode of consciousness. Aristotle's philosophy was the intellect's declaration of independence. Aristotle, the father of logic, should be given the title of the world's first intellectual, in the purest and noblest sense of that word. No matter what remnants of Platonism did exist in Aristotle's system, his incomparable achievement lay in the fact that he defined the basic principles of a rational view of existence and of man's consciousness. That there is only one reality, the one which man perceives, that it exists as an objective absolute, which means independently of the consciousness, the wishes, or the feelings of any perceiver. That the task of man's consciousness is to perceive, not to create, reality. That abstractions are man's method of integrating his sensory material. That man's mind is his only tool of knowledge. That A is A. If we consider the fact that to this day everything that makes us civilized beings, every rational value that we possess, including the birth of science, the Industrial Revolution, the creation of the United States, even the structure of our own language, is the result of Aristotle's influence, of the degree to which explicitly or implicitly merit accepted his epistemological principles, we would have to say, never have so many owed so much to one man. Aristotle is the champion of this world, the champion of nature, as against the supernaturalism of Plato. Denying Plato's world of forms, Aristotle maintains that there is only one reality, the world of particulars in which we live, the world men perceive by means of their physical senses. Universals, he holds, are merely aspects of existing entities isolated in thought by a process of selective attention. They have no existence apart from particulars. Reality is comprised, not of Platonic abstractions, but of concrete individual entities, each with a definite nature, each obeying the laws inherent in its nature. Aristotle's universe is the universe of science. The physical world, in his view, is not a shadowy projection controlled by a divine dimension, but an autonomous, self-sufficient realm. It is an orderly, intelligible, natural realm, open to the mind of man. In such a universe, knowledge cannot be acquired by special revelations from another dimension. There is no place for ineffable intuitions of the beyond. Repudiating the mystical elements in Plato's epistemology, Aristotle is the father of logic and the champion of reason as man's only means of knowledge. Knowledge, he holds, must be based on and derived from the data of sense experience. It must be formulated in terms of objectively defined concepts. It must be validated by a process of logic. Indicating that the early scientists had discarded Aristotle in rebellion against his religious interpreters, Professor Randall points out that their scientific achievements had, in fact, an unacknowledged Aristotelian base and were carrying out the implications of Aristotle's theories. Let us note the radical difference between Aristotle's view of concepts and the objectivist view, particularly in regard to the issue of essential characteristics. It is Aristotle who first formulated the principles of correct definition. It is Aristotle who identified the fact that only concretes exist. But Aristotle held that definitions refer to metaphysical essences, which exist in concretes as a special element or formative power, and he held that the process of concept formation depends on a kind of direct intuition by which man's mind grasps these essences and forms concepts accordingly. Aristotle regarded essence as metaphysical. Objectivism regards it as epistemological. For Aristotle, the good life is one of personal self-fulfillment. Man should enjoy the values of this world. Using his mind to the fullest, each man should work to achieve his own happiness here on earth, and in the process, he should be conscious of his own value. Pride, writes Aristotle, a rational pride in oneself and in one's moral character is, when it is earned, the crown of the virtues. A proud man does not negate his own identity. He does not sink selflessly into the community. He is not a promising subject for the Platonic state. Although Aristotle's writings do include a polemic against the more extreme features of Plato's collectivism, Aristotle himself is not a consistent advocate of political individualism. His own politics is a mixture of statist and anti-statist elements. But the primary significance of Aristotle, or of any philosopher, does not lie in his politics. It lies in the fundamentals of his system, his metaphysics and epistemology. Throughout history, the influence of Aristotle's philosophy, particularly of his epistemology, has led in the direction of individual freedom, of man's liberation from the power of the state. Aristotle, via John Locke, was the philosophical father of the Constitution of the United States, and thus of capitalism. It is Plato and Hegel, not Aristotle, who have been the philosophical ancestors of all totalitarian and welfare states, whether Bismarck's, Lenin's, or Hitler's. There is no future for the world except through a rebirth of the Aristotelian approach to philosophy. This would require an Aristotelian affirmation of the reality of existence, of the sovereignty of reason, of life on earth, and of the splendor of man. Aristotle and objectivism agree on fundamentals, and, as a result, on this last point also, but hold that man can deal with reality, can achieve values, can live non-tragically. Neither believes in man the worm or man the monster. Each upholds man the thinker, therefore man the hero. Aristotle calls him the great-souled man. Ayn Rand calls him Howard Rourke or John Galt. And that was a listing in a book called the Ayn Rand Lexicon, and the entry was, of course, called Aristotle. So, back in a minute. Okie doke, thank you very much. And now from 1993, we're going to wrap up the Playboy interview of Rush Limbaugh. So, Playboy, in her New York Times profile of you, Maureen Dowd portrayed you as a somewhat of a lonely type. Our questions: what were you like in high school? Were you active socially? Did you date a lot? Were you already career-minded? Limbaugh, my high school life was as normal as the average American kid's. Playboy, that's it? Limbaugh, there's nothing there. Into the tape recorder. Editors of Playboy, I was entirely normal. Playboy, looking down the line, can you see yourself like H.L. Mencken in his 70s, languishing somewhere, unlistened to, having once been the great social commentator of his era? Limbaugh, sure. And I don't want to be a curmudgeon. I want to have other sources of happiness in my life. So I say, Rush, you better find other outlets. You can't expect to get 100% satisfaction, 100% satisfying feedback every day for the rest of your life. If you get into that habit, you're headed for misery because it's not going to last. At some point, I'm going to get tired of this. There have to be other sources of self-satisfaction, other things from which I derive happiness. Playboy, and if there aren't, then maybe I overstay my time, go beyond it to where it isn't fun. But that's the last thing in the world I want to happen. And let's see. Whoops. There we go. So, so that's the end of the interview with Rush Limbaugh, and so it's kind of snotty at the end there about him, trying to compare him to H.L. Mencken. and who was curmudgeonly and rather, well, I think he was the one that said, in a democracy, the people get what they want, good and hard, something like that. But so he was, he was not somebody that liked people, I guess. And so, but anyways, kind of a baiting comment there. And again, Rush should have, I think, should have passed on that question and moved on. And then Playboy, and if there aren't, that last one right there, and if there aren't, raises the interesting point of fantasizing. A lot of times the left is going to they want the conversation to center around things that are imaginary, i.e., psychological in nature. What if this happens? What if that happens? So that requires you to converse about things that may not ever happen, may not even be probable in terms of happening, but it's getting you to look at things from a psychological perspective, and that's exactly where the left wants you to be. And so the correct answer for this one is, if there aren't, because he says, Rush Limbaugh says, at some point I'm going to get tired of this. Have to be other sources of self-satisfaction, other things from which I derive happiness. And if there aren't, now he's already said there have to be. Okay, a stronger statement would have said there are other sources of self-satisfaction. So by saying there have to be, he leaves himself open to that question, about if there aren't. And Limbaugh then concedes that, well, maybe there isn't. And since this is a benevolent universe, why not go ahead and be definitive about it and say there are other sources of enjoyment, and I will avail myself of them. And then you don't leave yourself open for that kind of comment. So, back in a minute. And thank you, thank you, thank you. So, and now I'm go to the Black Book of the American Left by David Horowitz. And when we left it, he was the lady that he had referred, named Betty, to work for the Black Panthers, had been murdered, and there's strong suspicion that it was one of the Panthers that had actually that actually committed the murder. And so all of the machinations and going-ons of trying to bring the individual or individuals to justice. When I arrived at Norman's, the North Berkeley restaurant that Huey had chosen, he was already there, sunk into one of the vinyl divans, his eyes liverish and his skin pallid, drunker than I had ever seen him. He was so drunk, in fact, that when the lunch was over, he asked me to drive him back to the two-story house that Bert had bought for him in the Oakland Hills, and left his own car outside the restaurant. When we arrived, he invited me in. I was a little nervous about accepting, but decided to go anyway. The decor, piled carpets, leather couches, and glass-topped end tables, was familiar. Only the African decorative masks that had been mounted on the beige walls seemed a new touch. As we settled ourselves into Huey's living room, the conversation we had begun at lunch continued. He told me about a project he had dreamed up to produce, Porgy and Bess as a musical set in contemporary Harlem, starring Stevie Wonder and Mick Jagger. It was a bizarre idea, but not out of the character for Huey, whose final fight with Bobby Seale had begun with a quarrel over who should play the lead role in a film Huey wanted to make. Huey even showed me the treatment he had prepared in Braille for Stevie Wonder, while complaining that the people around the singer had badmouthed him and killed the deal. When he said this, his face contorted in a grimace that was truly demonic. Then, just as suddenly, he relaxed and fell into a distant silence. After a minute, he looked directly at me and said, "Elaine killed Betty." And then, just as abruptly, he added a caveat, whose cynical bravado was also typical, as though he was teaching me, once again, how the world really worked. "But if you write that, I'll deny it." Until that moment, I had thought Elaine was solely responsible for the order to kill Betty, but now I realized that Huey had collaborated with her and probably given the order himself. It was the accusation against Elaine that provided the clue. He might have said, "David, I'm sorry about Betty. It should never have happened, but I was in Cuba and couldn't stop it." But he didn't. He chose instead to point a finger at Elaine as the one alone responsible. It had a false ring. It was uncharacteristically disloyal. Why point the finger at anyone unless he wanted to deflect attention from himself? I went home and contacted several ex-Panthers who were living on the East Coast. I asked them how Elaine, as a woman, had been able to run the party and control the squad. The answer was the same in each case. Elaine had not really run the party while Huey was in Cuba. Huey had run it. He was in daily contact with Elaine by phone. The squad stayed loyal to Elaine out of fear of Huey. The same sources told me that the fate of Betty had been debated for a week. Elaine had provided Huey with the reasons for killing Betty. Huey had made the final decision. In 1989, 14 years after Betty disappeared, Huey was gunned down by a drug dealer he had burned. It was a few blocks away from where Huey had killed the 17-year-old prostitute Kathleen Smith. It might have been poetic, but it was not justice. He should have died sooner. He should have suffered more. On the other hand, if I had learned anything through all this, it was not to expect justice in this world, and to be grateful for that which did occur, however belated and insufficient. Huey's death allowed Peter and me to write his story and to describe the Panther reality I'd uncovered. We called it Baddest, and published it as a new chapter in the paperback edition of our book, Destructive Generation. By now, we had become identified with the political right, although libertarian irregulars might better describe our second thoughts. What we wrote about the Panthers' crimes, therefore, was either dismissed or simply ignored by an intellectual culture that was dominated by the left. Even though Huey's final days had tainted the Panthers' legacy, their glories were still fondly recalled in all the 60s nostalgia that continued to appear on public television, in the historical monographs of politically correct academics, and even in the pages of the popular press. The Panther crime wave was of no importance to anyone outside the small circle of their abandoned victims. Then, in an irony of fate, Elaine Brown emerged from obscurity early this year to reopen the vexed questions of the Panther legacy. She had been living in a kind of semi-retirement with a wealthy French industrialist in Paris. Now she was back in America seeking to capitalize on the collective failure of memory with a self-promoting autobiography called A Taste of Power. It was published by a major New York publisher with all the fanfare of a major New York offering. With her usual adroitness, Elaine had managed to sugarcoat her career as a political gangster by presenting herself as a feminist heroine and victim. What Elaine Brown writes is so astonishing, croons novelist Alice Walker from the dust jacket of the book. At times it is even difficult to believe she survived it, and yet she did, bringing us that amazing light of the black woman's magical resilience in the gloominess of our bitter despair. A stunning picture of a black woman's coming of age in America, concurs the Kirkus Reviews. Put it on the shelf beside the autobiography of Malcolm X to the Los Angeles Times' Carolyn C. It is beautiful, touching, astonishing. Movie makers, where are you? In fact, Suzanne DePassy, producer of Lonesome Dove, who appears to have been the guiding spirit behind the book, is planning a major motion picture of Elaine's life. Time magazine's review invokes Che Guevara's claim that the true revolutionary is guided by great feelings of love, and comments, in the end, Brown discovers love is the most demanding political act of all. A full-spread New York Times Magazine profile of Elaine, a Black Panther's long journey, treated her as a new feminist heroine and prompted view and style sections of newspapers in major cities across the nation to follow suit. Elaine, who reportedly received a $450,000 advance from Pantheon Books, has been touring the book circuit, doing radio and television shows from coast to coast, including a segment of the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour, where she appeared on a panel chaired by Charlene Hunter Galt, as an authority on Black America. I hate this country, she later told the Los Angeles Times. There's a point at which you're black in this country, poor, a woman, and you realize how powerless you are. In contrast, Elaine once told me privately, the poorest black in Oakland is richer than 90% of the world's population. At Cody's Books in Berkeley, 200 radical nostalgists came to hear her, flanked by her bodyguard, Huey's old gunman Flores Forbes, who had served his 4 years on a second-degree murder charge for the Richmond killing and was now prospering in his new career as an urban planner. I read Elaine's book, jaded though I am. I was still amazed by its reception. The only accurate reviews seemed to come from the Bloods and Crips, who flocked as fans to her Los Angeles appearance, recognizing that she was a gangster like them. A Taste of Power is, in its bloody prose, and despite the falsehoods designed to protect the guilty, the self-revelation of a sociopath, of the Elaine I had come to know. I felt justified in trying to slap the life out of her. This is the way Elaine introduces an incident in which she attempted to retrieve some poems from a radical lawyer named Elaine Wenders. The poems have been written by Johnny Spain, a Panther who participated in George Jackson's murderous attempt to escape from San Quentin. Elaine describes how she entered Wender's office, flanked by Joan Kelly and another female lieutenant, slapped Wender's face, and proceeded to tear the room apart, emptying the desk drawers and files onto the floor, slapping the terrified and now weeping lawyer again, and finally issuing an ultimatum. I gave her 24 hours to deliver the poems to me, lest her office be blown off the map. Because Wenders worked in the office of Charles Gary, Huey's personal attorney, Elaine's thuggery produced some mild repercussions. She was called to the penthouse for a reprimand by Huey, who laughingly told her she was a terrorist. The reprimand apparently still stings, and Elaine, even now, feels compelled to justify the violence that others seemed to consider merely impolitic. It is impossible to summarize the biological response to an act of will in a life of submission. It would be to capture the deliciousness of chocolate, the arousing aroma of a man or a perfume, the feel of water to the dry throat. What I began to experience was a sensation of personal freedom, like the tremor before orgasm. The Black Panther Party had awakened that thirst in me, and it had given me the power to satisfy it. The thirst for violence is a prominent feature of this self-portrait. It is a sensuous thing to know that one's will, an enemy can be struck down, Elaine continues. In another passage, she provides one of the many instances in her book of this pleasure. Here, it is a revenge exacted, after she becomes head of the party, on a former Panther lover named Steve, who had beaten her years before. Steve is lured to a meeting where he finds himself looking down the barrel of a shotgun. While Elaine's enforcer, Larry Henson, holds Steve at gunpoint, Elaine unleashes 4 members of the squad, including 400-pound Robert Hurd, on her victim. 4 men were upon him now. Steve struggled for survival under the many feet stomping him. Their punishment became unmerciful. When he tried to protect his body by taking the fetal position, his head became the object of their feet. The floor was rumbling as though a platoon of pneumatic drills were breaking through its foundation. Blood was everywhere. Steve's face disappeared. The taste for violence is as pervasive in Elaine's account as is the appetite to justify it in the name of the revolutionary cause. She describes the scene in Huey's apartment just after he had pistol-whipped the middle-aged black tailor Preston Collins with a .357 Magnum. Collins required brain surgery to repair the damage. Collins' blood now stained the penthouse ceilings and carpets and walls and plants, and Huey's wife's clothes, even the fluffy blue and white towels in the bathroom. This is Elaine's reaction to the scene. While I noted Huey's irreverent attitude about the whole affair, it occurred to me how little I, too, actually cared about Collins. He was neither a man nor a victim to me. I had come to believe everything would balance out in the revolutionary end. I also knew that being concerned about Collins was too costly, particularly in terms of my position in the party. Yes, I thought, F. Collins. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and leave it at that. Only a few more pages to go in this particular chapter, and we'll pick it up next week. So until then, thank you very much for joining me, and have a great day.